Well, good morning. Today I'm going to present the city's executive budget for the next fiscal year, which, let me remind you, begins on July 1st. And it is a budget that is less than last year's budget. Not just less after inflation or less than the projected growth, but less money total, period. Let me begin by saying that New York City's economy is in much better shape than it was a year or 2 years ago, and we are in much better shape than most other cities. We entered the national recession later than the rest of the country, and we came out of it faster and stronger than the rest of the country. But we still have a long ways to go to get back to where we were in 2007. And so we are better, but compared to where we were, we are not there yet, and we have a long ways to go to get there. And one of the sad things, or one of the things that people have trouble realizing, is expenses are easy to increase in good times, but they are very difficult to decrease when times get bad. And the business model of a city like ours is that we have increased expenses at the very time our revenues decline because people need more help. Last year, I'm happy to say, we outpaced the nation in job creation thanks to the investment that we've made in our 5-borough economic development plan. And our budget is also in better shape than most cities thanks to the responsible way that we prepared for the inevitable downturn in the national economy. And it's something we did in partnership with the City Council and particularly Speaker Christine Quinn. And when we look at the numbers in a moment, you will see that we have bounced back strongly. Key industries are growing, and our business tax revenue is climbing back near its pre-recession peak. But we are not an island. We are not immune to the realities in Albany and in Washington. And the reality is, both places are keeping more of our tax dollars to close their own budget deficits. Each year, we send both places far more money in taxes than we get back in services, and this year is no exception. This year, we are going to get back even less than in the past, about $2 billion less than anticipated and less than our fair share. Now, I am sympathetic to the needs for budget cuts in Washington and Albany, particularly Governor Cuomo I'm sympathetic with. He inherited some very tough fiscal problems, and he has to address those problems in the ways that he thinks is best for the state. Unfortunately, most of the actions that the state did take to close its deficits were reduction in local aid, and I'll show you that. And they did that without changing the burden that our city taxpayers and taxpayers in the other 57 counties must bear. So basically, the state's problems have been moved down to become our problems. Now, we had hoped that Albany would restore more education funding. They did not. We had hoped that Albany would treat us equally with the rest of the state when it came to cuts. They did not. And we hoped that Albany would adopt mandate relief measures that would have saved us hundreds of millions of dollars at no cost to the state. They did not. But they still can, and we'll continue to work with the governor and legislature on reforms that would have real cost savings for New York City taxpayers and would benefit, in many cases, all of the other 57 counties as well. In the meantime, however, New York City has to produce a balanced budget. The law requires it, and good sense requires it. And the circumstances we find ourselves in today, the decisions that we are forced to make, are largely a product of the disinvestment of the state and federal governments and Albany's failure to adopt cost-saving reforms. Now, we are doing everything possible to reduce the need for cuts so we can keep making our streets safer and our schools better, and so that we can help people find jobs, get out of debt, keep their homes, feed their families, and get access to vital services. That's what we're supposed to be doing. These are very tough times for many New Yorkers, and thinking about the families who most depend on city services makes the decisions in this budget even more difficult for all of us. Our goal is to make sure that we have a strong city and that we protect vital services and the social safety net that keep our communities healthy. And that's why we worked so hard to restore thousands of child care vouchers, which we think are critically important to so many working mothers and fathers. If they didn't have a ways to find care for their children, they couldn't work. And we want to encourage people to be in charge of their own destiny and to be self-sufficient. So making sure that they can go to work really is a high priority. As difficult as this budget is, we know that next year's budget is going to be even more difficult, and so we can't put off the hard decisions. If we were to postpone taking action now, this year's problems would not only be added to next year's problems, but there would be a compounding effect that would make the situation more than twice as bad next year. So it won't be easy, but by making responsible choices and by continuing to push for reform in Albany, we can do it. And we will do it. And we will do it without raising taxes. This year, in many areas, we have had to increase spending in spite of federal and state cuts to meet state and federal mandates and to keep our city moving forward. For example, to make up for some of the state and federal education cuts, we have increased city funding for schools in this budget by $2 billion. That is more than the school budgets of virtually every other than a handful of cities in this country. To do that, we have had to use up a majority of the reserves that we have put aside over many years. But the state and federal education cuts to the city are so deep that even that will not be enough to avoid layoffs of some city employees, particularly teachers, since both the federal and state governments specifically targeted education for cuts. When I first became mayor, the city and state were sharing the cost of education about equally, with the city paying about 51% of the cost, not counting federal aid. In 2008, the city was paying 55% and the state was paying only 45%. Since then, the state has continued to cut back on funding to our schools. And next fiscal year, the state will pay only 39% of our school needs, and the city has to pick up 61%. Keep in mind also that the cost of providing education goes up every year. Another $500 million next year over this year just because of mandated spending in special ed. Another $80 million just because of step functions built into the current contract. And I might point out the governor has already said that next year's budget for him, which will be in our next fiscal year, he expects another $500 million in cuts to education. If the state was still paying 50% or even close to it, we would not be talking about laying off teachers. But sadly, that is just not the case. The state has made a decision to reduce spending on education. Here in the city, we are increasing spending on education to make up for that cut. But even New York City cannot cover the entire whole. Now, I understand the frustration that parents and teachers feel. I feel it too. No city in this country has invested more in education and made more progress in education than we have. That's been the #1 thing that we have focused on. If you want to solve society's problems, better public education is a very good place to start. But we certainly know that we still have a long ways to go. We have a lot of work to do. And the state budget cuts are just going to make that harder. That's just the reality. But we are not going to walk away from our education system. Now, we've asked the state to minimize the impact of their cuts by providing us with mandate relief, which would not cost them 1 penny. Unfortunately, that's not happened, at least not yet. We're still hopeful that the state will adopt mandated reforms, including pension reforms. In New York City, unlike in some other jurisdictions, you should know, we fully fund the actuarial obligations of our pension system, rather than leaving that to future mayors and future generations. We don't kick the can down the road. But unless the state helps us get our pension costs under control, we are not going to be able to afford the services that New Yorkers expect, demand, and think they're paying for. Next year, we will pay $8.3 billion for pension costs, up from $1.3 billion in 2002. That is a $7 billion increase in 10 years. And the question we have to face is, do we want to give future retirees, not the current retirees, but future retirees, benefits that we can afford, or do we want to buy services, do we want to give future retirees the benefits that we can afford, or do we want to pay for the services that we need now? It's an either-or thing. You can't do both. The other alternative is to pay them at a level that we think is sustainable. The current level just is not sustainable. We have to decide, do we do that or keep the status quo and continue making major cutbacks in education and social services and public safety? Because the bottom line is, no matter how much we cut back, the growth in the pension costs are eating up all our cuts and then some. I think the choice is clear. and we'll continue working with our partners in Albany to adopt pension reforms that make sense for employees and taxpayers. I've talked to the governor about this. He campaigned on pension reform. I've told him I will do everything I can to help, and he really is trying. But we have to find ways to get our pension costs under control, or the cuts will just be so draconian this city and all cities in this state cannot continue to do what they've been doing, provide the services that people really need. By doing everything possible to minimize state and federal cuts in education, and we'll say we've had to cut back in other areas and in other services. Over the past 4 years, we have had 10 rounds of spending reductions. And today, there are 16,000 fewer people working for the city than when I took office. We have reduced headcount across city agencies, including in the fire, police, and education departments. Today, we have nearly 5,000 fewer police officers than we did when I first came into office. Having said that, to show you the quality of the fire department and its leadership, and Commissioner Kelly, in the same time they've had 5,000 fewer cops, they have driven crime down 35%, lower than it was back then. We have hundreds of fewer firefighters than we did in 2001. And to show you how well this world's best fire department under Sal Cassano has been doing, they have driven fire deaths down to an all-time low, and emergency response times have never been faster. We've even had to reduce the number of teachers by a smaller percentage, and yet our students are achieving and graduating at record levels, something that Chancellor Walcott will continue to do. Government's job is not to spend money. It's to manage and provide results. And that's what we've been doing, and that's why we're able to do more with less. But this year, we are having to conduct deeper layoffs in many agencies. And unfortunately, that includes the Department of Education. Now, some have suggested that we use every penny we've saved to make up for the state and federal cuts. But responsible budgeting is not a one-year process. You have to look at it over multiple years, and you can't be dependent on one-shots. We are now using 2/3 of all of the reserves we put together to balance this year's budget, which means for next year, we have only half the amount that we're using this year to balance that budget. And remember, for next year, we are facing a deficit projected to be over $5 billion. That's for the year that starts July 2012. The fact is, if we're going to turn and expect money from Albany and from Washington, I think that is not likely. We cannot expect Albany to treat us any better next year, nor can we expect them to make our mandated increases in expenses go away. So unless something changes in Albany, our pension costs are going to continue to go up, the cost of state mandates will continue to go up, and our deficit will increase. As a result, the budget that we're preparing 12 months from now is likely to even be more difficult than this one. So it would be irresponsible to spend every penny we have, and we won't do that. We're not going to put our future at risk. This budget is full of difficult decisions, and I expect special interest groups and elected officials to protest. But I will say that when we were fighting in Albany to have just $200 million in local aid restored and to get more than $1 billion in mandated relief, we didn't have very much company up there. If we had had more support on these issues, this budget would have had many fewer cuts and layoffs. But unfortunately, that just wasn't the case. So we are forced to do the best we can with what we've got. Now, it won't be easy, but we will balance our budget and protect the core services that are so important to the quality of our life, that will allow us to continue making neighborhoods safer, our streets cleaner, our schools better, our parks greener, and our economy stronger. This city has the best hand of any city I know of to play. We have worked together. We've made enormous progress. In spite of the budget difficulties, I'm convinced we can continue to do that. Easy? No. But we are not going to walk away from our responsibilities, and we are at the same time going to act fiscally responsibly.